Hey everyone, this is Shelby. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're here to talk about my favorite books that I read in 2022. I've divided these up into a top 10 list split by fiction and nonfiction. I generally am a reader of fantasy, a little bit of sci-fi, and then a lot in the world of feminist nonfiction. I read memoir and sort of feminist theory, and then of course a lot about gender-based violence and kind of just the world of feminist policy, which is something that I'm really personally interested in and of course professionally interested in as well. Let's go ahead and jump right in. A few notes on how I read and just like reading goals in general for the year. I was a huge bookworm as a kid and really fell out of reading as an adult, and I picked it back up probably about 3 years ago. As I was being reintroduced to reading, I wanted to, set really reasonable goals for myself that would encourage me to read, but not feel guilty that I wasn't reading enough or getting into that comparative headspace. So every year I set the same reading goal of 24 books, 2 books a month. And that's a goal that I feel really comfortable with, but I just want to highlight that, if you read even just one book this year, that's something that brought you joy and that's all that matters. I don't want to contribute to the comparison game that sometimes happens on BookTube, BookTok, in the online bookish community. I read in a number of different formats. That's something that's very different about me as a grown-up as a reader, as opposed to being, a child and teen who read a lot. I do have a pretty large physical library of books, and that is, building out for a dream library one day. But I also read using the Scribd app, which is really great for audiobooks as well as digital copies of books. It's a monthly subscription service, and I think it costs less than $10 a month. The library is limited, but it's a pretty considerably sized library, and you can download as many items as you want each month. It's not sort of on a credit basis. I also have a library card. I live in Chicago, so I have a card to the Chicago Public Library. And while I don't check books out physically from the library, I have taken to checking out digital copies of books, which has been a really great way to be able to expand my reading and read more on a whim. So that's kind of the different formats that I use to access books. Okay, we'll start with nonfiction. I feel like nonfiction reading sometimes gets the short end of the stick. The first book that I wanted to share that I didn't actually purchase and own physically is Dark Archives by Megan Rosenblum. This book is a fantastic read at any point in the year, but I think especially if you're looking for something a little darker and creepy in the fall. It is not memoir exactly, it's sort of an investigative piece written by a medical librarian, really looking at the world of books that are bound in human skin. And she writes about that in a really interesting perspective. She really interrogates the books that are allegedly bound in human skin and kind of what informs that belief and the technology we have to determine whether or not they were in fact bound in human skin. And then in large part really dives into sort of the medical ethics around how we historically have really thought about bodies and about consent and about who is important and who is deserving of bodily autonomy. So it's a really interesting investigation. It has kind of an ick factor. It has a really interesting selection of, very curious historical stories of really interesting authors, and then whether or not the stories they wrote were bound in human skin. It's a story that kind of requires you to have a bit of a tougher stomach, but if it really calls out to any part of you, I highly recommend reading it. The other book that I don't physically own in the nonfiction category is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy. Jennette McCurdy, famous for her role as Sam on iCarly, was a person who I didn't necessarily think I cared all that much about before this book. I watched iCarly casually, but I wasn't a massive fan as a child. The book is fantastic. I listened to it on audio, and I highly recommend listening listening to it on audio if that's accessible to you. The story is, it's a memoir covering really the full range of her life to date. It picks up as she's a very young child, and explores a lot of really tough themes. So I really recommend checking content warnings about the book before you pick it up. It explores, what it meant to be a child star, particularly as a child who wasn't very interested in that, but as someone who had really kind of pushy parents about, child acting. But much more importantly, it explores a really complex and abusive relationship with her mother, a really distressing and ongoing experience with eating disorders, the way that those really traumatic things can then lead to other issues like substance use and abuse and challenges in her own romantic relationships. It's a saga. It's honestly, it's a riveting story, if riveting is an appropriate word to use there, but Jeanette tells it with a lot of, I think, grace for her younger self, and she writes from this incredibly compelling perspective where when she's writing about something that happened at the age of 7, it sounds like her 7-year-old self. Her voice really evolves as she ages in her story, and so you really hear how her logic and understanding of what was happening to her changes over time. It's just an incredibly compelling story. It's wonderfully written. Jeanette is clearly a beautiful writer, and has clearly done a lot of work to be able to, come to peace with what has happened to her and how she wants to live her life moving forward. So it's a beautiful, beautiful story. And I highly recommend it to anyone who feels like, they're in a good place to read a book like that right now. The next book on my nonfiction list is The Turnaway Study, which was written by Dr. Diana Green Foster. This is an incredible, groundbreaking study that was done on the impact that accessing abortion services has on people's lives. Prior to this study, which took place over the course of 10 years, there wasn't a lot of great evidence about comparative outcomes. So there were lots of, allegations made from people who are opposed to access to abortion that say people who have abortions regret them, that they're emotionally distressing, that they have bad life outcomes. And similarly, people on the, pro access to abortion side of the debate really felt strongly that it was an essential component of giving people autonomy over their lives and led to better outcomes ultimately. So this study was run by having the researchers set up in different abortion clinics across the country, and connecting with folks who were pregnant right before they went in for that appointment to determine whether or not they were eligible for services. And then followed those people, whether or not they were turned away or were able to successfully access the abortion that they had sought. And through this, we have this really incredible natural experiment, right? Because there are different laws in each state that say at different points in gestation whether or not you can access an abortion. And we see how these people's lives are shaped by whether or not they had access to an abortion. It was more than 1,000, I believe, participants, which means that we really see a full range of life experiences and are really able to therefore zero in on access to the abortion being what causes difference between these two groups. I think it paints a very clear picture about the ways in which access to an abortion are essential for women and people who can get pregnant to have full control over their lives, and importantly, the lives of the people who depend on them. So it explores the outcomes for the pregnant person's existing children, who are more likely to be successful in school, to be living without hunger. It explores whether or not the person who is pregnant remains in a dangerous relationship, whether or not they are able to achieve their short and long-term personal goals, their access to employment, whether or not they're on public benefits. it's just an incredibly clear and concise and groundbreaking piece of work that I highly recommend to anybody who is interested in the conversation around abortion and abortion policy. And I think especially for folks who feel on the fence either way, it's an incredibly evidence-based approach to a really hot topic that invokes a lot of personal feelings in people. And I think it does a good job of taking a lot of like high-level data and then connecting us with personal stories. There are, I believe, at least 10 personal narratives woven throughout these larger database chapters. And I think it does a great job of sort of reminding us that these are debates about people and people's lives and their dignity. So I highly, highly recommend it if you have the chance. Next up on the nonfiction list is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. Carmen Maria Machado wrote Her Body and Other Parties, which is a collection of short stories that I love so much. It's a great piece of work, and this story, In the Dream House, is actually a memoir that explores predominantly what it was like to live through an abusive queer relationship. And I think this book is important for so many reasons. Of course, again, you'll want to review content warnings, as this is a really difficult subject. But we don't see and hear a lot about what relationship violence looks like in the queer community. And I think Carmen's testimony about what that was like to live through is just so impactful and really, again, beautiful isn't the right word, but beautifully told. She is an artist at heart. She writes the book in second person, right? So her story is, you're sitting in the car, your girlfriend gets in the car, you talk about XYZ. And that perspective, while jarring at first, has this incredible impact on the way you sort of fall into the story. You feel like you are living through what she lived through. And it experiments with lots of different styles. There are moments of like pure poetry and other moments of really sort of like staccato writing that really just explores what an incredible, craftsman she is in terms of writing, but then also really tells an important story from a perspective that we don't hear enough from. So I highly recommend exploring this if it's something you feel up to right now. I will also add, I listened to it on audiobook, and again, because it is, from that sort of memoir, first person point of view, I found it really compelling. So I would recommend the audiobook. Last on the nonfiction list, we have We Do This Till We Free Us, which is by Miriam Kaba. This is a book all about abolitionist theory and its intersection with feminist theory, but really in practice, right? So it's not this like sort of heady, high-level discussion, but rather looking at the ways in which we as communities of people who are invested in ending violence need to better be in conversation and learn our histories to ensure that we are practicing anti-violence in an inclusive and thoughtful way, and in a way that moves us away from systems like prisons, with recognition of the harm that those cause to the people we're supposedly trying to protect. So she explores a lot about experiences of criminalized survivorship, which is an issue that I'm really personally invested in, professionally, and just as a human being. So issues around folks not being able to claim self-defense if they had been abused and harmed, and then their life was threatened and they defend themselves against that harmful other person. But it explores lots of other things as well. It's predominantly a collection of articles and essays that she's written over time. So, something that was in a magazine here and then a letter to the community there. It's really accessible. The chapters are fairly short. And I think the topics are pretty wide-ranging. So if you are someone who is interested in sort of anti-gender-based violence work, feminist practice or abolitionist work and theory, I highly recommend this book. It's really sort of I think, becoming a piece of bread and butter literature where, if you do this work, you should be reading what Mariame Kaba has to say about it. So I highly recommend. It was something that I find myself referring back to a lot now. Okay. Now we are on to my top 5 fiction choices, and first on that list is A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. This is the second book in her series that all ties back to A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. It's often described as being for fans of Firefly, which was a fantastic sort of sci-fi space adventure story, but it is all the more like heartwarming, and it really centers queer characters. I loved that book, and that book has been widely raved about on the internet, but Closed and Common Orbit is the second book in that series, and I loved this book. I think I liked it much more even than A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. It follows somebody who was sort of a side character in the first book, and then sort of the life that was built around them. And it really takes a very interesting approach of exploring artificial intelligence and personhood and cult-like behavior and cloning, and it ties so many really interesting themes together. And I found the characters to be just incredibly endearing, and I just loved it. So I highly recommend, of course, if you already know that you like Becky Chambers, you should have this on your reading list. But even if you haven't read her other books, you don't need to have read the first book in this series to pick this book up. And I found it to be such a quick and compelling read that I would highly recommend it, even if you don't typically read a lot of sci-fi. Next on my fiction list is The House on the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. I'm a little late to the party on this one. Everyone and their brother is obsessed with The House on the Cerulean Sea, but if you haven't already heard the synopsis of this book, it is set in a world not unlike ours, but where there is magic, and there is a program, basically Child Protective Services, specifically for magical youth. We follow a kind of dejected and burnt out child welfare worker who is assigned to investigate an orphanage for the most dangerous magical children. And we see him, this sort of buttoned up, rules first caseworker, go to this beautiful, quirky little orphanage that is run by just sort of the most animated and warm and loving man. And he meets these supposedly dangerous children. And of course he falls in love with them, and he finds this incredible, beautiful sort of family with them, and it explores what it means to be different and how society treats people who are deemed different. And it also contains a really beautiful sort of love story in it as well. This book was just like heartwarming to the core. I read it as a beach read, which was great as well, but like if you are looking for a pick-me-up, this is that to a T. It is the perfect, cozy, heartwarming story. Next on our fiction list is this brick of a book, The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This book, where to even begin? First of all, it's enormous. Don't be intimidated by that. I certainly was for a very long time. This book has incredible world building. It's a world, sort of your classic like high fantasy, epic fantasy setting, a world where there are dragons, and actually some important distinctions are made between kinds of dragons. We follow a queen and a spy and a scholar, these really quintessential characters on these adventures across the world. And you just see so many incredible, captivating places, and these really sort of like intricately woven political sort of angles that are going on. So I would say It did feel quite slow, but it was a beautiful kind of slow, so it was worth the slog, in my opinion. It has elements of almost that Game of Thrones level political maneuvering. Um, there's not a ton of action going on. The action scenes are, I would say, intermittently throughout and more limited in scope. And I don't know that the payoff quite landed for me, but the journey of this book was so beautiful and so interesting, and I couldn't put it down for that reason. So I highly recommend, if you want to feel fully like transported to another world, this book is your way to do that. The only book that I don't have physically for this section is Kindred by Octavia Butler. Kindred is a fantastic book. I've read now 3 or 4 of Octavia Butler's books, and she is just such a magnetic and like electric writer. Her writing is so all encompassing of your attention. Kindred is, I think, technically a sci-fi novel, but it is written about a woman in the 1970s who gets sucked back in time accidentally to the time of slavery in the American South. And so we see her trying to survive and trying to understand what the connections are between the past and the future. As a Black woman living in this incredibly bizarre and terrifying experience. It is really difficult at times. You would expect that, I think, when you're reading about the enslavement of human beings. But it is also such a page turner, and I think really thoughtfully explores a lot of really tough issues. And it's kind of its own little time capsule, because it's written in the 1970s from the perspective of the 1970s on slavery. And then you are reading it now in the 21st century and kind of get that additional perspective of the last like 40 or 50 years. So I highly recommend it. If you don't have any Octavia Butler in your previous reading lists, you should absolutely be picking her up. She is a fantastic author, and there's a reason why she's a classic. And finally, in terms of fiction that I would recommend, we have Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson. Her Majesty's Royal Coven is a really fun, very modern witch story. The basic premise of the book is that magic exists in our world. It's a secret from non-magic havers and users, and there is sort of an official department in the British government and in most governments across the world that is a formal sort of government coven that handles all of the, sort of magical problems that might arise. It follows 4 childhood friends who are in roughly their mid-30s, and it explores what like coven politics have done to shape their lives. It's a really interesting commentary on race, and also importantly on gender and what it means for covens to be women only in the 21st century. I don't want to give too much away, but without sort of like stepping into hinting at the plot in ways that could be spoilery, but it is action-packed, could not put it down. And it sort of faces the question of, is this a world-ending threat that we face, or are we just being asked to change? And, what kind of grace and patience can we approach those world-ending challenges with, potentially? So it's just so much fun. Again, it's a very queer story, and it's a really, I think, fun way to explore like modern feminist politics through the like fun of a magical witchy setting. Hello, editing Shelby here. Thought I would hop on just on my quick webcam, kind of a la Carrie Cake style, because I can apparently only count to 9. I missed a fiction book on my top 10 list and wanted to make sure I shared it with you all. It is Monsters We Defy, which is a really fantastic and fun story set in sort of Prohibition era, so 1920s Washington, D.C., in a predominantly Black community.
And it is sort of like a classic heist story with lots of those kinds of classic archetypical characters. And the magic in this story is sort of old, sort of spiritual style magic. So the idea is that there are spirits who can grant you um, functionally a wish, but in return, you also are granted a trick. Sort of that trade of if you want magic in your life, what will it cost you? And so we follow one heroine with a very particular gift who realizes the people in her community are going missing and kind of has to pull together this team of people, all of whom have their own sort of secrets and magic that they've traded for to try to find out what was going on and to make sure that the folks in her community are able to find safety. And beat the big evil bad guy. So it's a really fun story. I love the setting. It has such a great sense of place and of time. The magic is really interesting. And it has, I think, a lot of great glimpses into communities that you don't always get great visibility for in stories like this. So I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. And it was a new release in this past year that I don't know got as much hype as normal. It was Elliot Brooks who turned me onto the book. She talked about it a lot on her channel, and I really loved it as a result. So that's book number 10. See you all later.
Well, that's it for my favorite top 10 books from 2022. I would love to know more about what y'all read this year and what you're excited for in the year to come. I know I have a lot of anticipated releases coming out this year and am very eager to get started on some of the reads I'm hoping to knock out in 2023. Thanks for joining me here. I am still very new to YouTube and to BookTube and am enjoying just like the process of learning how to make these videos and trying to connect with people who love the same things as me. So please feel free to leave more information about what you've been reading and what you think below. I will see you all later. Bye.